The Lord's Vault by David Kerr. Sir Cade and Sir Taran, esteemed diamond knights of Rail, had been in the southeasterly border town of Kerr for the last 10 days. Dispatched by royal command, they had been tasked with calming the locals in the wake of numerous disappearances. Initial progress had been slow, particularly given the resentment held towards King Boran's rule. He would normally not have bothered with such a problem, but Kerr was of strategic importance, and the man was always anticipating the next war. "So," Taran asked as they walked down the dimly lit hallway, "do you not think it would be best to inform the king before proceeding?" His voice seemed to fill the voluminous space above. Cade turned with a vague look of disbelief etched onto his features. He did not appear impressed by the suggestion. "These people cannot afford the time it would take to do so. Besides, I sorely doubt the king would believe my conclusion. But is that not all the more reason to inform him?" Cade glared at his fellow knight, immediately ceasing the discussion. As the hallway continued its descent far below the castle and into the bedrock, the light seemed to become ever dimmer. Aen, the castle guard, raised a solitary candle before him, trying to augment the scant illumination. Whilst it barely assisted them, the gesture was none the less appreciated. His other hand was hovering over the stubby, worn sword tucked into his belt. It may have been offering him reassurance, but, if Cade were correct, it would do very little against their prey. "The Lord is going to be so fucked off with us when he finds out we're down here, you know," Aen said, his hands beginning to shake a little. "We are here," said Taran proudly, "on the king's authority. That supersedes any power your lord may seek to wield here." "Well, if you don't mind me asking, sir, can you be the one to point that out to him?" "Gladly." Taran's prompt response caught everyone by surprise. Was he really thinking this through? Poor bastard, Aen thought. He had no idea what kind of shitstorm he'd be walking into there. As they descended ever further, the ornate walls gave way to plain stone and aged, crumbling mortar. There were no longer any gaslights. They were left with the solitary light from the candle that glowed impotently against the dark. "That's not at all foreboding, is it now?" Cade asked sarcastically. "It does seem like an unwelcome sign." Taran checked the strap on his shotgun and made sure it was snug against his body. Cade touched the grips of his two pistols absent-mindedly. As the air chilled, anxiety began to rise in them. All sounds seemed to be in hasty retreat. Their footsteps became softer and softer, and only the background hiss of stillness whispered in their ears. The two knights began to see Aen's breath raise lethargically in the air ahead, the chill nipping at their skin. They were determined to push ahead, but the poor guard was getting ever more nervous at what was to come. He began to speak once more, hoping it would help soothe his fear. "So how long have you been knights? You both seem quite young for it, if you don't mind me saying so." His hand was now clutching the grip of his sword, his knuckles turning white. "I've been a knight for 8 years. Sir Taran has served the king for almost 5, Cade replied as he tried to peer further into the darkness before them. "So, do you like being a knight?" Cade raised an eyebrow and thought, "Do you like being a guard?" Aen immediately barked. "Ha! Well, it's a job. My family said I'm thick as pig shite, so there ain't many choices for the likes of me around here, and they can kiss my spotty bollocks if they think I'm going to become a knacker." Cade chuckled at the blunt response. Taran seemed to slightly wince. Where one saw humour, the other saw a crass man who did not respect his work. "In answer to your question, yes, I very much like being a knight. I'm sure Sir Taran would say the same." Taran nodded but showed no other sign. Something ahead had caught his interest. "Gentlemen," he peered up at what looked like iron teeth across the ceiling. "I thought this portcullis had not been raised in decades." His night vision was clearly sharper than the others, and they strained to see what he referred to. Squinting and slowly shuffling forwards, they kept their eyes trained above, and, sure enough, after a few feet more, they saw the bottom of a raised portcullis, the recessed mechanism in the wall pulled tight and braced with a section of wood. "I would imagine that this is not a good sign at all." Cade removed one of his pistols from its holster. "You're buggering light, it ain't!" Aen was finally succumbing to his nerves. "What shall we do?" Taran asked of Cade, who was already thinking ahead. "All right, you remove that wooden brace, or cut it in two, whatever needs doing to get it out. And we're going to cross the threshold here, and then I want you to lock it behind us. Then, and I am sorry to ask this, we shall need you to await our return." He shook his head and looked down. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. I thought the worst thing I'd be dealing with was chicken thieves or something." Cade spun his pistol around and offered it, handle first, to the scared guard. This is loaded with 6 bullets, all silver-tipped. Anything comes this way, they'll do what's needed. Understand? The man was trembling with fear, but there was a look in Cade's vibrant green eyes that was instantly reassuring. He let go of his sword and took a firm grip on the pistol in its place. He didn't say anything more. He simply nodded. Good man. Cade patted him on the back and walked over to Taran. Ready? Ready. Gripping the wood beneath his gauntleted hands, Taran began to wrench the brace free. Cade took a hold of the handle, clutching it as steadily as possible. The plank began to give up splinters and slightly larger pieces. Chips and chunks started falling to the ground. Taran growled as he strained ever harder. A hairline crack began to run along the length, the sight of which brought a smile onto his face. His muscles wrestled against his armor as his biceps gave their all. It violently split in two. Taran sent one half flying down the hallway behind them. The other limply fell to the floor, its dull sound echoing about them. Aen took the mechanism's handle from Sir Cade, and the knights thanked him. Stepping into the gloom, they began running their hands along the walls. There'd be torches nearby. They were sure of that. Cade? Taran called in a loud whisper. I have found one. Whilst he couldn't be seen in the bleak dark, he was holding a torch aloft as though it were the greatest prize known to man. They both went back to the guard, who politely lit it for them. You can lower the gate now, Cade told him. Right you are. The portcullis clanged and rattled as it lowered into place, dust spilling out from the grooves it was running along. Aen almost felt sorry for getting a bit of it on the two knights, but then he pictured them in battle, and quickly realized they'd probably been covered in far worse. Thank you, guardsman, Taran stated in his ever-refined tone. Thank you, Cade said. Now remember, don't open this for anyone except us, and not until we give a password, which will be tenderloin steak. Taran gave him an inquiring look. What? Cade answered, shrugging. I'm hungry. Right you are, sir. Aen tried to give a smile, but couldn't find it in his heart. For all the reassurance these men could give, he was still scared. Oh, and sirs, do keep an eye out for that oil reservoir. Old Magnus says that's how they used to light the castle, and there should be one around here too. Put a flame to that, and the whole underground should get lit. Thank you, Aen. We're indebted to you. And I to you, sirs. Please, be careful. Aen sat on the cold stone below with his candle and his pistol, and waited. Sir Cade and Sir Taran, however, ventured into the antiquated bowels of Kerr Castle, determined to kill a vampire. Thank the gods, Aen muttered. I haven't quite shit myself yet. The first room the two knights found themselves in was octagonal in shape, with stone benches protruding from the walls. They were chipped and crumbling in parts, and had obviously seen much use in their past. Now they stood, cold as ice, to never be occupied again. Remains of fine mosaics were scattered across the floor, no signs of their former glory left. Where intricate patterns once lay, only chaos. Cade absorbed all this about him. Taran, however, was more focused on moving forwards. Forgive me if it is impertinent to ask, but what is it that makes you so sure that this is the work of a corruption? As Cade stepped around under the smattering of tiles, he began to reply. From the first 3 cases, there really wasn't any sign at all. Yes, they'd all been taken at night, but what kind of kidnapper would strike in the daytime? There'd been no witnesses, no screams, no sounds at all. Suspicious how anyone could do that given the circumstances, but still, not enough. It was only with the 4th incident that I got an inkling. They both passed through the chamber and into a slender room with a small pool at its centre. In it, an automated pump was working as well as the day it had been built. They could hear the slick, gloopy flow about them. The smell of oil and dust was not as repellent as either had expected. The only failed abduction, Miss Howell's fortunate escape. Correct. They began searching for the brazier which would, in turn, illuminate the oil-laden gutters along the walls. But I don't think it was sheer luck that saved her. Did you happen to notice anything about the location in which the incident happened? Cade walked over to a wrought iron burner around 3 feet high. There were aged, brittle twigs still residing inside. Ah, Taran, put the light to that, will you? He politely obliged, and they both watched as flames quickly roared into life and across into a recess in the wall. A moment later, and a controlled blaze rushed along, igniting all the oil and giving light to the room and many others further along. Well, Cade smiled, that's a little better. Taran cast his torch into a corner of the room, and they resumed their talk. I'm afraid I did not notice a single thing out of the ordinary, except perhaps as to how someone accessed the 3rd floor of a home so easily. I'll admit, that did perplex me, but there was something specific about that room. Miss Howth said that she had been preparing for a tryst that night and was selecting clothes in her dressing room. Cade felt Taran's judgment in that moment. He clearly thought the girl should not have been living some aspect of her life outside the watchful gaze of her father. The man had obviously not lived much, and we could tell by the disturbance in the room and her recollection that it was by the wardrobes that the struggle began. Taran answered with a nod. But I don't think our assailant was expecting quite the resistance he got. She said she was able to drive that pin through his hands several times and they fought violently. Yet it was not until they neared the window that the attacker howled in pain and fled. Why? Because... And then Taran had a problem. He could not think of a single good reason why moving just a few feet made such a difference. It was because they were by the mirror, Cade said triumphantly. I am afraid I must plead ignorance. I still do not understand. They reached another hallway that descended further still. The orange glow of the flames flickered along the walls, seeming to beckon them onwards. Neither man relished the thought of going deeper underground, but they had no choice. What are vampires said to be fearful of? The word of the gods and the brilliance of silver. Should you ask almost anyone, man, woman, or child, they would give this answer. Correct. However, and I do hope that I don't offend your sensibilities here, but the word of the gods doesn't do a damn thing. He felt Taran tense, but silver, on the other hand, is most effective. Which is why Cade fiddled with a metallic collar that was clasped around his neck. It seemed to be causing him a degree of irritation, but he was prepared to bear it. We're wearing these damned uncomfortable things. But how does that relate to a mirror? Cade smiled. All mirrors are backed with silver. And remember, she said she never saw her attacker. But how could she not have when she was facing a full-length mirror? Taran nodded readily in agreement. Very well, I find myself in agreement. Yet, is this still not even more reason to inform the king? Fail or triumph, he'll get word, I promise you. Cade assured him, the word of Diamond Knight, his bond. Taran did not question it for a second. Very well. Let us slay this beast and return to the king. Or die valiantly, Cade thought. Reaching a fork in their path, the men looked at each other, both deliberating the same question. We can flick a coin if you like, Cade asked, trying to cut through the oppressive mood that shrouded them. There is no need. I volunteer to take the right path. Taran stood straight as an arrow, trying to impress the senior knight as best he could. That is very brave of you. Then, I shall take the left. Try and stay going in a northwesterly direction like we've been on thus far. They both checked the compasses they wore about their wrists and nodded to each other. Good luck, Sir Taran. And to you, Sir Cade. Thus, the two knights entered into the winding passages of a demon's labyrinth. Cade followed the trail of flame along the walls, taking in as much of the surroundings as he could. The decorations had all become far more basic and primal. The first archway he came to was adorned with the pantheon of the greater gods, their features lacking the intricacy and detail of more recent artistry. The more he stared at it, the more he began to think that this was part of the castle that wasn't just old, it was ancient. The ceilings were far lower here. At almost 6 feet tall, Cade started to feel claustrophobic as the clearance above his head became sparse. There was a loud slamming sound nearby, and mortar and dust scattered over him. His eyes rolled to heaven. He knew he should have been expecting something like that. Taran was probably sealed in. The same would no doubt happen to him in another step, and a stone partition shot upwards, sealing off any retreat. The noise made Cade's ears ache. More detritus was dislodged from between the bricks, and a thin haze formed around him. For a moment or two, he was blind and found himself frantically blinking, his eyes streaming, hoping to return his vision to normal. Still, if a wall and some dust was the worst that it was going to be thrown their way, he was more than happy to live with that. But not for a single moment did he believe they would be quite that lucky. Cade rubbed his eyes clear and began to delve deeper into this uneasy space. Even with the fires burning, the corridors were icy little tunnels leading to more icy little tunnels. So many leading to dead ends or chasms in the walkways. Pommet had prepared him well, though.
This,
he would angrily shout whilst brandishing Cade's sword,
means fuck all if you can't use this.
The hilt of the sword would then be enthusiastically wrapped on his head. The man had made him study hard, to stretch his capacity, to test his intellect and memory. He knew the brain required training just as much as the body, and such diligence had repeatedly saved Cade's life. He had been making considerate efforts to imbue Taran with the same wisdom. Cade came to a sudden halt again. Another pit, laden with spikes. He didn't strain himself to look into its depths. There was nothing good to find there. He just marked another dead end upon the map inside his mind. Hopefully, Taran was going about things in a similar fashion, instead of going in blindly, hoping that luck, or faith, would sufficiently guide him. He paused as the thought struck him. A pang of anxiety leapt up inside of him. No, stop worrying. You've taught him well. He'll be fine. Hopefully. Walking down a fresh corridor, Cade saw suspect tiles that were slightly raised above all the others. I've got to get out of here, he muttered to himself, and get myself a steak. Then he spat out some dust from his mouth. And a drink. His approach was slow and cautious, looking for any subtle change in the space around him. He was expecting pressure plates and traps. A normal corridor or even a maze would not be sufficient. Crypts and dungeons always seem to have convoluted designs and devices to snare the unsuspecting. Cade tried to keep his calm, but there was an angered voice in his head, vexed by all the stupidity that went into creating such things. He stepped over the apparent trigger and very gently settled his foot on the other side. When he'd finally settled his entire body weight beyond the trap, he afforded himself a little sigh of relief. He'd already been wandering these halls for almost a quarter of an hour and wanted free of their confines. He was confronted by more dead ends as he went further in. Tedium upon tedium. Clearly this labyrinth was designed to sap them of their will to live, perhaps to make them voluntarily impale themselves on their own swords just from the sheer boredom. Still, he had to keep focus. Remember Pommett's lessons. Don't be rash. Use your brain. Stay alive. He took a right turn that brought him back onto a roughly northwest direction. Even better, it looked long and uninterrupted, with no signs of any triggers along the floor or blades in the ceiling. Just a corridor. Cade sighed. There clearly had to be something extremely wrong here. Then, the clunking sound began. Consistent, mechanical, continual. The configuration of this entire place was making it hard to locate. Echoes bounced through every corridor, and the clunking seemed to be getting louder. He started walking down the corridor, perhaps a little more briskly than caution would demand, but he had no intention to stay near that damnable sound. The acoustics in the room were starting to change. The echoes were becoming softer, but the noise was getting louder. What the hell was happening? He looked over his shoulder and felt his stomach clenched tightly. The entire corridor was getting shorter, a lot shorter, and it was shrinking at an alarming rate. The entire wall behind him was speeding towards him, clanging gears hundreds of years old, still able to propel it at a dizzying rate. Cade abandoned all care and began running for his life. He had been chased numerous times in his life, of course he had, by childhood bullies to axe-wielding maniacs, but he had never found himself hotly pursued by an 8-foot-tall slab of stone. His legs were roaring into life. Adrenaline was kicking in across his entire body. He would not succumb here, particularly not to something so patently ridiculous. Even in that cold gloom, he was beginning to sweat beneath his armor and coat. Sweat collected at his brow. In spite of his speed, the wall was closing the gap. He could hear it getting closer. Don't look back. He pleaded with his body to give him more. His arms pumped furiously as he sought to escape, and somehow, he felt like he could get through this. At least he did, until his feet planted hard against a set of raised tiles. That was when the floor ahead of him began to separate, and his inner monologue became an angry mess of profanity. Cade shifted over to the left as the floor kept moving away from the center. The space below was inhabited by 2 rusty cylinders covered in short spikes. They span furiously, desperate to consume new prey. Cade pushed himself to his absolute limit. The walkway was about to get too thin. He still had perhaps 12 feet left to cover. His muscles were on fire now, and he could feel the wall at his back. Stay calm, listen to Pommett, think about the space around you. Cade knew he couldn't make the jump to safety. He leapt from the walkway as it slotted against the walls. There was a flood of memories in that moment. Not of his entire life. After all, who would want to revisit much of that? Instead, he found himself in the courtyard of the academy, Pommett screaming at him as he conducted agility training. He was being made to do extra after telling Pommett he was a knight, not a circus act. The truth was, however, that he was neither, and his trainer made that abundantly clear to him by taking his sword and then watching him encounter calamity repeatedly across his assault course. He could still feel the aches he would experience after every session. He was given twice as many as the others. He thought at the time that he was being tortured. He was too young and stupid to realize that the man saw potential and was making sure it was realized. The man had invested so much in him. more than he had known back then. His final gift, the sword forged from legendary Black Sun steel, was passed on as he departed for his new life.
"You'll need this one day,"
he said with supreme confidence. Cade's feet connected with the wall, and he continued his run, hoping to defy gravity for as long as he could. His boots gripped the rough stone surface superbly. For just a second, he felt as though he was flying. Passing over the deadly mechanisms below, he felt a sense of freedom. It was short-lived, however, as he realized he was falling faster than he had hoped from all the equipment he carried. He pushed off from the wall with all his might, and slammed down to the ground. He looked for an exit, there, on his left. He took a sharp turn, never breaking pace, and heard the stone wall slam behind him. He tumbled to the ground and just stopped. He'd move in a moment, but for now, his scorching muscles would have a minute or two. He would say a short word of thanks to Pommet, and then play out a short fantasy in his mind, in which he travelled back in time and murdered whoever designed this utter hell. An hour passed until Cade was finally free of the labyrinth. After his run-in with the hulking wall and the grinders below, he'd almost been sliced in two by a giant-bladed pendulum, riddled with scores of arrows and almost set on fire. As he caught his breath in the small chamber beyond, waiting for Taran, he quickly got impatient and looked for any way to assist his fellow knight. Whilst there was more of the grotesque primitive art inlaid in the walls, he could not see anything that would permit him to halt any traps or machines. Instead, he had to wait. It was all he could do, and, for someone of Cade's disposition, it was far from ideal. He sat there, buttocks freezing on the icy stone, for another 20 minutes until he heard gears rumble and another doorway open up. He was pulled out of the thoughts he'd been dwelling in of Sir Taran succumbing to one of the traps along his way, and now found himself doused in sheer relief. He stood smiling and readily took Taran's hand and shook it with enthusiasm.
"Damn good to see you. And you, sir?"
Cade took a step back and looked at him from head to toe. Not a single mark on him.
"By the gods, man, you look unscathed. Excellent."
More relief came to him, and then he quickly started to calm and return to his usual self.
"I'm afraid I must ask," said Taran, "what might have scathed me? The traps, of course, the blades, the arrows, the crushing walls."
Taran looked somewhat confused.
"I'm afraid I do not know of what you speak. For all my time consumed in the labyrinth, I faced only dead ends and mirrors,"
he answered crisply.
"No traps. At all."
Cade leaned in.
"None whatsoever."
Cade blinked a few times in disbelief.
"Next time, Taran, you are taking the other path." "Understood."
Taran gave a curt nod, and the two men moved to the centre of the chamber.
"Well, providing your leisurely walk has not exhausted you, I think we should press on ahead and finish this once and for all."
Taran checked the barrels of his shotgun and snapped it shut again.
"Agreed, sir."
They confidently walked ahead through the final archway into yet another octagonal room. The fire gutters fed into 4 braziers set about the space. Their light was so scant, and yet more of the unsettling artwork was across the walls. Macabre scenes of gods and monsters locked in battle about them. A central area was flanked by 8 columns, each decorated in an unnerving organic design, their veiny patterns twisting upwards, creeping into the ceiling. In the middle of the space, another octagon raised from the floor to a height of around 3 feet. Upon it, a sarcophagus. This, the menu, was the creature's lair. Cade pulled back the hammer on his pistol. Taran gripped the shotgun tightly. A screeching echoed in the distance.
"Get ready."
Cade's mind was completely focused on the battle that was to come. Emotion had drained from his voice. At the other end of the room, 2 iron doors retracted. From the pitch black beyond, they came.
"By the gods,"
Taran whispered.
"So many of the beasts." "Calm yourself. These are the vampire's foot soldiers. Do not waste your energy on fear. Expend it on ending these monsters."
The din was almost deafening as they burst forth. 20 familiars came hurtling towards them in a whirl of fury and bloodlust. How long had they been down here? At the front, with its blue, rotting skin, gnarled and misshapen teeth and vacant eyes, the leader of the charge made a line for Cade, fixated on him. In reply, the knight pulled the trigger on his pistol, sending a silver round into flight to deliver freedom to the wretched soul. The bullet smashed into its teeth, sending splinters of molar into its desiccated flesh.
Its eyes didn't show a single change as the bullet passed through and severed its spine and burst out, blowing a hole in the back of its head. It shambled forwards a pace or two. Then, as Cade had hoped, it began to dissolve, coming apart as though it were nothing but dust in a strong breeze. As he took fresh aim, he heard Taran's shotgun roar into life, tearing his targets asunder. Cade fired again, his bullet ripping through the chest of another, passing out and striking a stumbling creature just above its right eye. The noise of gunfire filled the chamber, angering the creatures and driving them into a more excited frenzy. Cade and Taran split and took cover behind two pillars as the men reloaded. Taran ejected the two shells and loaded fresh ones from his bandolier. Brass casings rained on the ground from Cade's pistols, and he slotted in fresh bullets as quickly as his hands would allow. He heard the boom of Taran's shotgun as he loosed another shot, repelling an advancing group from reaching Cade. He quickly nodded in thanks and let loose again, watching legs shatter, arms be blown free from their shoulders. Covering Taran as he stopped to reload again, Cade felt anger. King Boran was denying the return of magic, but all the stupid bastard had to do was open his eyes to look right there. The supernatural was once again part of their world, and no amount of denial was going to change that. He gritted his teeth and emptied the last chamber, ripping a mandible free from a hulking familiar. He dropped back as he reloaded and let Taran move into the fore, unloading more silver buck into their enemies. No shouts of fury, just icy professionalism. He spent his second shell before Cade had finished reloading. One of the creatures took this as an opening and screamed at him. By the gods, his ears ached. His vision began to wobble, but he stood his ground. The familiar leapt into the air, its claws reaching out, and fortunately for it, Taran spun his shotgun about and struck it with all his might across the side of its skull. As the bone gave way and began to contort and crack, the entire head became wrenched from the beast's neck. Liberated, it struck another in the head, momentarily dazing it as Taran took steps in retreat. Cade snapped his pistol shut again. There were perhaps 7 or 8 left, but they were burning through ammunition quickly. Precision was being sacrificed to necessity. One familiar continued to drag itself across the floor, even though it retained nothing below the waist. It still had its heart and its head, so it kept on. This was the next to be freed by Silver Bullet. Cade, however, had no time for satisfaction. The last few were pushing them back.
"Drop back through the arch!"
he instructed, and Taran dutifully obeyed.
"When?
Cade fought to get his breath.
When you pass into the archway, give them everything."
Taran nodded and raised his shotgun once more. His cheeks flushed, his hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. His usual confidence was starting to drain. The screeching barreled towards them. The sound burst into the chamber.
"Now!"
Taran fired, and Silver Buck ripped through the chests of a handful of the familiars. The ones behind stumbled over the bodies as they were sent backwards. They struck the ground and began to dissolve. Again, with unrelenting determination, they came, picking themselves up. They refused to stop.
"Again!"
Cade bawled. Taran's shot lifted one of the creatures off its feet. It had dissolved before it could even strike the ground. The one behind looked puzzled as it stared at the gaping hole in its chest. It looked at the knight in utter confusion. It went to raise a hand to the void, but found it had already crumbled before it could touch it. Dropping to the floor, it became another pile of dust. Taran fell back, his ammunition depleted, and Cade once more took the lead. There were only 2 left now, and his hammering heart was most thankful. Taking his time with his first shot, he felled the first with no bother. Quickly, he moved up to the last. It tried to claw at him, but he batted the arm away. Pressing his gun to its temple, he fired. The octagonal chamber was laden with blue dust. Cade's hand quivered. These creatures had been human. Once. He felt fury as he killed the last. He felt like he was doing the universe's dirty work, and resentment bubbled up. The universe relied on him too much sometimes.
"Sir Cade!"
Taran had been talking to him, and he had not heard a word. The man was still gasping from the exertion and looked pained at having to repeat himself.
"Sir Cade!" "Taran, I'm sorry, the vampire will have to face us now. Stow your shotgun. Do you have any bullets left?"
Cade opened his pistol and sighed.
3, which is unlikely to be enough.
Taran put his shotgun down on the ground and drew his sword.
"Then we shall fight as our predecessors did, with a blade in our hands and our enemy but a step away."
Cade admired Taran's bravery, even if sometimes he was a little on the dramatic side.
"Let's finish this."
Cade was filled with focused resolve. Damn the king and damn the obstructive lord of this place. Diamond Knights fought for honor and what was right, and he would do just that. The 2 men, side by side, walked towards the sarcophagus as a scraping hiss started to seep from the rattling lid. They had fought wild creatures, thieves, soldiers, other knights. This, however, was like nothing they'd faced before. A thin mist began to swirl around their feet. Light glinted from the blade of Taran's broadsword as he hefted it to one side. The temperature dropped even further, slowing the blood in their veins. The tomb's lid began to grind across the stone. The rumbling reverberated through their feet, but they pressed on. Remember,
The heart or the head?
Taran did not look away from the tomb, but croaked out a small reply.
Yes.
For the first time in his life, he was contemplating the possibility that he would not be going home, that he would be felled here, and possibly even turned into one of those creatures. Whilst never seeing his parents again gnawed at him most insistently, he found that it was not their loss that would hurt him the most. Nan Erskine's face came to the fore of his mind. He would miss her most, he knew, as well as the content of her smile. Why was it that only when the prospect of death came that he finally found some clarity? Cade's thoughts, however, remained solely focused on the octagonal room, the books he had read, and the beast they were about to face. Since the return of the ill star, the world had begun changing so quickly, yet so few were willing to admit it. The lid flung open and crashed to the ground. The creature emerged in a blur and shrieked. They had expected something, but nothing quite like this. A hunched form padded to the ground, its long, muscular arms, riddled with pulsating veins, stretched wide, its wings mirroring the gesture. Black as tar, covered in a thin layer of grey hair, it seemed to suck in the dim light of the room. Its torso was pure muscle, its neck thick like that of a bull, topped with a thick, pointed skull. The features on its face were sharp, with eyes the colour of blood, teeth shining white, nostrils flared, drawing in the scent of the carnage that had played out. It moved not like a human, but with the fluid grace of a panther. If there had been a trace of a man in there, it had long since departed. There would be no witty exchanges or long speeches. This thing was operating on pure instinct, firm in the knowledge that it would have to eradicate these interlopers if it wanted to see another nightfall. Their eyes bored into one another, waiting for the moment it would all begin. The creature's senses were touched by the smell of their fresh and virile blood. Its legs tensed as it readied to move. Cade pulled the trigger of his gun, sending a bullet sailing through the air. It clipped the creature's shoulder and the battle began. In quick succession, Cade fired his remaining bullets, but it was already on the move. One grazed the creature's forearm, and the other missed entirely. He dropped his pistol to the floor and began drawing his sword. He wasn't going to be fast enough. The distance between them had melted away. He prepared to roll under its attack. Taran's broadsword came flying upwards, blocking the creature from delivering a blow to Cade. Its talons struck the tip of the blade and 3 fingers were hacked free, setting Black Ichor free from the stumps. It wailed in fury and struck Taran in the chest. He took to the air and landed in a pile of blue dust, skidding along until his back struck one of the columns. The sheath to his sword cracked loudly as he cried out. He'd bought Cade time, who drew his sword and slashed at the creature's ankle. It screamed and looked down at him with fury. It tried to take a step and found that its tendons had been sliced through. Bringing an arm crashing down, Cade rolled out of the way. The arm broke the ground beneath, tiles sent up in the air by the sheer force. Looking over, Cade could see that Taran was dazed. He had to lure the creature, keep it from him. He began shouting nonsense at it. Didn't matter what he said, he just had to hold the damn thing's attention as long as he could. But it wasn't moving at all, and worry set in. Almost as quickly as they had been severed, its fingers began to regrow. The slice in its heel was another story. It was struggling to close, and it forced the bloodthirsty fiend to hobble towards him, the space too close to engage in flight. Cade was astonished by the speed of its healing. But what of the cut he had inflicted? He looked at his blade, a gift from Pommet. It was no ordinary blade. It was made of Black Sun steel. Whilst he still felt underprepared, he afforded himself some confidence. For some reason, having been made from raw material from the Black Sun marshes, this blade could inflict lasting damage on the beast. It began to move again, but was cautious of Cade, and turned its attention to the downed Taran. Sloping over to the downed knight, it bared its teeth and began to make a hissing sound. Without a second's thought, Cade charged in. The creature spun on the spot and raked a hand across, blocking with his sword. The Black Sun steel sliced through its forearm, detaching it cleanly. Steam sizzled from the wound, and it became filled with fury. A low swipe, Cade leapt over the attack, quickly followed by a high swipe. He ducked, his silver-coated gauntlet striking the creature in the stomach. It staggered for a moment, but recovered quickly, issuing a forceful punch towards its centre mass. A deft pivot, and its fist connected with the pillar behind Cade, bursting stone forth across the ground. He had to be careful. This creature was furious. It was not going to go down easily. More black ichor dripped to the ground from its wounded arm, a smell of iron and rot raising into the air. Taran was slowly getting back on his feet, and Cade was thankful. He did not want to lose a comrade, and he sure as hell didn't want to fight this beast alone. It advanced on Cade, closing the gap again, and swung its arm backwards, ready to swipe at him. He readied himself to deprive it of another forearm, but this was a trick. It moved its arm forwards, then quickly pulled it back and feinted in the opposite direction, before ramming its immense skull right into Cade. The Diamond Knight struck the ground with incredible force, and the world was spinning. His sword scattered across the ground and into the dust. Taran's broadsword drove into the leathery hide of its back and burst through its chest. He held on bravely, trying to drive it deeper. How had the blade missed its heart? It began violently twisting on the spot, shrieking, screaming, its arms flailing, desperately trying to strike Taran. He held on as though his life depended on it. Flapping its wings chaotically, it propelled itself backwards with unnerving speed, slamming Sir Taran against one of the macabre reliefs. He spat blood and released the immense blade. He slid to the floor, utterly winded. He took in ragged breaths, but it wasn't working. The enraged beast moved to the nearest pillar and rammed its chest against it. The weighty blade was pushed out of its body, crashing to the ground, covered in more of the black tar that ran through its body. It fixed its gaze on Taran and walked towards him, absolute rage inside. The wound on its chest was already knitting together. It lowered itself over the body of the day's knight, and its special teeth unsheathed themselves, anticipating the feast. Its remaining hands circled most of his body, and the creature went in for its treat. The shrieking dislodged mortar. It made both knights writhe in agony. Clutching at its mouth, it tried to hold together its dissolving lips. The silver collar had worked. The foggy and bloodied Taran let a rare smile come across his face as he watched his would-be killer reel from the pain. He tried to stand, but his body was still confused and didn't hear the command. Cade was crawling across the ground now, desperately seeking his sword, running his hands through piles of dust. Taran's look of pleasure quickly turned to one of terror as the creature scooped his fellow knight from the ground. Get up! Get up now! Held aloft, Cade was still struggling to stay alert. The burnt and distorted face of the creature moved in close and breathed the dank smell of death upon him. I'm not going to die today. Not to this bastard. Doing the only thing he could think of, he rammed his head into its face, cracking the thick bone of its nose. He pulled back and rammed again as the creature's grip became tighter. Again and again he smashed his head into it, the room spinning about him, but he wouldn't stop. Then, baring his teeth, he went in and sank them into the misshapen nose that now adorned its visage. It felt like he was chewing on old leather, but he didn't give in. He wasn't going to let this monster go free. Its nose ripped away. More blackness poured from the wound, and Cade spat the flesh and fluid into its eyes. Stumbling forwards with his recovered blade, Taran roared and hacked through one of the creature's legs. It crashed to the ground, and Cade slipped from its grasp. It whipped a wing in an arc, but Taran clumsily rolled free of the attack. The Ica pumped from its stump, wings still flapping madly. Moving in, Taran gripped the sword with both hands and drove it downwards, pinning a wing into the ground. It fought hard and began to tear its own flesh to get free.
Cade, please, quickly! I can't hold on. I can't hold this for long.
Out of the mist and dust, Cade reappeared, brandishing the Black Sun's steel. It raked its hand across the ground, barely missing him. With that, Cade broke into a run. Its wing was almost free. The last bit of flesh tore, and it hit Taran in the jaw, knocking him out cold. Cade, with a renewed fury, sprung into the air, a scream filling his lungs, and swung the blade down in a furious strike, cleaving right through its neck, freeing its head, driving right through its shoulder. Black ichor spurted like a fountain, spattering both men, the ground and the walls. The creature slid down to one side and crashed into the ground. Within moments, it began to crackle and burn, reducing itself to ashes in mere moments. The aching Cade dragged himself over to Taran, black blood dripping from every inch of his body, and checked on his fellow knight. He was alive, but battered to hell. He dragged him to the small chamber, and there they sat until his eyes fluttered open.
Is it dead?
Cade coughed.
Yes, thank the gods, but it's definitely fucking dead. Now come on, we have a shit-scared guardsman to go relieve. Tenderloin steak? Tenderloin steak,
Cade replied, and raised Sir Taran to his feet.
Now, if you don't mind, I think we'll take your path back. That,
Taran replied before wiping blood from his lip,
is something I shall support. Glad to hear it.
The two Diamond Knights began shuffling towards the exit.
You were bloody brave back there, you know,
Cade proudly told Sir Taran.
I was merely doing my duty. Oh, do shut up, Taran. Modesty will never get you a raise, nor any accolades. Accolades? Us? Just please,